Thank you again for coming today. My talk is titled Life, a Story of Opportunity. And for anyone that knows me, it's not really surprising that my talk has a lot to do with evolution, but more so than just me trying to convince you why evolution works. We all know about the theory of evolution by natural selection, and it makes a lot of sense. What's good at surviving will survive, and that's not hard to understand. But it is kind of hard to understand, hard for our minds to wrap itself around how a bunch of atoms swirling around can kind of lead to all this complexity around us. And so I want to kind of talk about some of the things that underlie evolution and make it possible. And the first is this property called antifragility. I got this from a book I just read that I'll show you in a second. Essentially, antifragile it can be described a lot of different ways. One of the ways to describe it is it's open to change, and it's not static, and it can take advantage of new opportunities. Like I said, the inspiration for this, I've long been a fan of science and love reading all these books. This one was actually, he's an investment banker turned philosopher, and he wrote this book that I'm going to be using a lot of the terminology from, and very few of these ideas in here are original ideas of mine. I just kind of want to pass it on and put a biological spin on it. So first, let's talk about what is antifragility. And because it's a word, it's a compound word, and it's basically saying something that's not fragile, let's start by talking about what is fragile. We can obviously all picture something like this if it falls to the ground and the stress breaks it. Then, if somebody asked us what was the opposite of fragile, we might say strong, robust, resilient, in that whereas the fragile things break, robust things don't break. We can look at that as a baseball. A baseball can get hit really, really hard, and yes, it can come apart eventually, but it's pretty stable. Now, antifragile is something that, whereas fragile breaks and robust doesn't break, and we might think that's the opposite, we can really go even farther in the other direction and say something that's antifragile gets better because of the stress, or once it's stressed, it overcomes it and changes into something different. And for this, we could look at something like steel, or adversity. When steel is put through this fire and compressed like this, it comes out stronger than it went in. And so this is, another way we can look at it is something that's fragile, has limited options. Those china plates, they stay there, and they can't really do much else. They can really only break. The baseball, too, is more robust, but that can also break. And then something that's anti-fragile comes with something like the carbon and the steel we just saw, where it can you can stress it and it doesn't either break or stay the same, it can become something else entirely. And there is an entire spectrum from fragile to robust to anti-fragile. It's not necessarily that you have to say one over the other, it's in relation to each other we can describe them. And the first thing I realized, I don't know if you mentioned this in the book, but I thought matter is pretty fragile. We have hydrogen atoms here, and we take it for granted, but every day in our sun, these hydrogen atoms, because of the temperature and pressure that they're put under, combine to become a helium atom. And this is something, obviously you can, like I said, it's not permanent, it doesn't necessarily have to stay like this forever. It can be, a helium atom can be fragile and can be broken down, theoretically, back to its constituent parts. But rather than just withstand this pressure, the atoms kind of act funky and become something new. And this is kind of the beginning of the opportunity where once it's presented with a problem or a stress, that it can become something new entirely. And then, granted, it's not through nuclear fusion, but once we have all these different elements, they can combine in a bunch of different ways. Here we just see some normal organic compounds. And these kind of a bunch of different things, they're naturally produced in a lot of places in our universe. And here we go, these elements and these molecules they're very stable and robust. They can react and change into different things that go around. But if you take like a cyanide atom here, you can take another one and it's hard to distinguish the two. There might be different isotopes of them. And even when you combine them, it's kind of the sum is equal, or the whole is equal to the sum of its parts. There's not really a deeper level to it, so to speak. One thing that life came along and did was our genetic code has been able to take into account, it's almost if you look at it in a certain way, it's a record of what happened in the past. So you can go through our our genome and see what our ancestors had to deal with. And they're almost recipes, each of our genes, for when they're presented with a certain situation, how can they react to this. And this makes life very, very anti-fragile, in that when it's presented with something new, it doesn't necessarily either have to break or stay the same. So we have here a very simple diagram. Let's say an organism has these 3 genes. Gene A helps it withstand poison. Gene B is when it's put in a watery environment, and that helps it adapt to that. And then gene C will be if it's exposed to heat. So each of these genes on their own necessarily is contingent upon what it's exposed to. If it's exposed to one of these things, it can overcome it. And each of these are fragile to an extent. Each of these can be lost. But the genome as a whole is now something bigger than the sum of its parts, in that it enables behavior that can change over time. Another way that nature can take advantage of this is that not only can there be random mutations that happen in our genome, but also through stresses in the environment. One thing that's good about the genetic code is that it is very redundant. I think it's something like 1% of our DNA is actually being used. The rest of it is left over from viruses or helps do other stuff. But a lot of it, a really, really small part, is the important stuff. And so it's robust to the extent that it can withstand a lot of stuff and still accomplish its functions. But also, you can have a mutation. This could be through a chemical that you take in. It could be through ultraviolet radiation, anything. And it can change it. And a lot of the times, if it hits something that is very important and causes what's called a nonsense mutation and destroys the important protein, obviously somebody can die. But the other possibility is that it makes something better. And one gene that's, I'm sure you guys have heard about, that kind of encapsulates both is sickle cell anemia. That's due to a mutation in a gene, and most people don't have it because it's bad. If you have two genes of that type, then you'll have sickle cell anemia. But it sticks around because, it's mainly in African populations, because if you have one of the two, then you have a resistance to malaria. So the genome can accomplish a behavior, but it's kind of pliable. It can respond in different ways, and time will tell. Time will help weed these things out. So the good ones will stay more, and the bad ones will leave. So this slide, we can kind of say that this will be a theme that I'll be bringing up throughout the rest of it, is that you can have these individual things that are part of something, and those can be fragile. You can have these genes come in and out of the genome, but the genome itself becomes anti-fragile because of this. It can adapt. If a gene's cut out, that's breaks, so to speak. But the genome doesn't necessarily break. The genome will stay together. And then by the same token, if we can say that the genes of one genome or the genome is better than the genes of that, we can also say that the genomes of multiple organisms are fragile, but they can add up and make a gene pool that a species has access to. And that will be even more fragile than the genomes. And so here we get back to these 3 hypothetical genes. The green one helps withstand poison, blue for water, and red for heat. If we put a poison in here, the ones that don't have that gene for poison will be selected against and will exit the population. And therefore this green one will be passed on. And this is kind of similar to how antibiotic resistance occurs. So we can see that these organisms, while each of the organisms is fragile, and the genomes, those individual genomes are fragile, the whole collection of the gene pool will benefit from this. It'll be stronger and will have adapted to this and will evolve. And so this is just the slide I showed before, just showing how these individual genomes are fragile. They can be destroyed, but they help to create a very strong, cohesive gene pool. And now when we get above an organism, that's one of the main parts of Charles Darwin's theory, is that there's a bunch of competition, only the strong survive, survival of the fittest, etc. And this is just a cool image I found of a macrophage, one of our immune cells that's trying to stop harmful invaders from getting in. And competition is definitely part of it. There is competition, even though I didn't talk about it amongst genes, genes just try to get themselves copied and passed down to the next generation, so they compete too. but it's something that's a lot easier for us to understand when it's on an organism level. But it's not the only story. And one of the coolest things I think that I've ever heard about is, it's called the endosymbiosis theory. And it's basically, instead of these two, we had what are called eukaryotic cells, but everything started out as a prokaryotic cell, which is a simpler version of it. And long ago, rather than competing and fighting against each other, where it was zero-sum and one lived and one died, they cooperated, and the bigger one subsumed the smaller one, and they had a win-win situation where they were both benefited from it. Now here's a picture of some of our cells, and these red things in here are actually our mitochondria, and those would provide energy for our cells. And this is it obviously wasn't this advanced when it started, but we have a DNA in our nucleus, which is in blue here, and then each of the mitochondria, which started out as a completely separate organism, also have their own DNA. So there's kind of a coevolution going on here, and both of our cells benefit from this, as well as the mitochondria with the protection of being inside of our cell. So then we can look even higher up the hierarchy, and we can see that the cells, tissues, and organs of our body, each of those is very fragile on their own. Many of our cells get destroyed all the time, and obviously none of our organ systems wouldn't be able to survive on their own. They all need each other, and it makes an organism which is stronger than any of these substituent parts. And the same for an organism. Organisms can be, this is also on what is traditionally thought of with Darwin, is that within a species, the ones that are best at surviving they'll compete amongst each other, and the ones that are best at surviving will survive more. But there also is a lot of cooperation, and because the organisms can kind of be selected for, the species as a whole can be stronger. And then up again, we could say that no species in itself is more important or more anti-fragile than the ecosystem as a whole. The ecosystem, species can come and go, and can either go extinct or thrive, and the ecosystem is going to be this whole part that can get stronger and will keep interacting with itself. So up until now, we've been talking pretty much just about how life got here and properties of it, and that's kind of cool. But I really want to talk about how antifragility can apply to our lives right now, and things that are relevant to us. So the first example is our bones. We all pretty much know, we have the astronaut on the right here, that when people go into space, they come back, and the astronauts, they show them walking all tenderly. And it's because when you don't have these stresses, so sometimes these stresses are good. And for instance, our bones need that constant compression, and they basically have microfractures. They basically break on a very small scale, so you can say that the bone cells are fragile, and it makes the bone, the system, anti-fragile. And same with muscles. I mean, anyone that goes to the gym, you push yourself and you put yourself under a stress, and not unlike the steel that's going through the fire and all those harsh conditions, it comes out stronger in the end. But sometimes it's very natural of us, so we don't like difficulty, and we think, oh, if something's hard, or something has bad possibilities, then it's bad for us, and we should try to avoid it all. Here's, I thought, a cool Bubble Boy thing. There's soap everywhere and anti-sanitizers, we're always trying to avoid these things, but it's not necessarily always the best thing for us. And especially with our immune systems, part of the way they work is that, like our genome keeps a record of the past conditions that it was in, so it can have these recipes and plans for what it might be exposed to. Our immune systems also work in a similar way, in that they remember what they've encountered before, and so they can be prepared for it the next time it comes. And so if you aren't exposed and stressed by these initial germs, then your body might not be able to react as well later. And this principle we've kind of taken into account with vaccines. Essentially what a vaccine is, there's a bunch of different types, but it's essentially notifying ourselves of of a potential germ or virus, and then making sure that so that it's not caught off guard whenever it does come into contact with that thing. So rather than trying to just prevent it all, we should try to make ourselves stronger by small doses of it or inactive doses of it. It's essentially what a vaccine does. And another example is with forest fires. We all know Smokey the Bear, and we all whenever we go out, try to be conscious of what we're doing and not affecting the environment. But this also, trying not to start a fire, is, and I'm not encouraging to be reckless out there, but there's also some bad things that can come from it. And if we are very careful about not starting fires, we can have all this brush build up. And nature works by temporarily. It'll weed out things, it'll trim the fat, there's a number of terms for it, but it needs these periodic kind of eliminations, for lack of a better word, to kind of keep things in order. And sometimes when we don't have these fires and we allow all this tinder to build up, it can result in a huge fire that will even be worse than what would have happened in the beginning. And as you can see, this is a pretty big fire that could have been avoided if we had smaller fires to kind of periodically stop these. Another cool example that he gave in the book was the Titanic. Titanic was a horrible incident and no one would want to have it happen, but his point was that had we not had the Titanic and gotten the information from that, we would have just kept building bigger ships, and eventually it would have happened just like we had that fire before. We don't want any of them, but if we can't avoid them, it's better to have a smaller one rather than a bigger one. And a real cool example of something that he focuses on a lot more in the book, I went with the biological perspective, but I think it goes with our society and with how our collective works, is the market booms and busts, and there's been a lot of stuff in the news the past couple of years about the financial cycles and whether we're going to grow and all that's going on. Here's just a basic thing about booms and busts, and the thing is it was understood a while back that markets do go through cycles. You can't constantly have something growing. You need to have kind of growth and relaxation periods. But we've kind of recently, I think it started with, there may have been others before, but Alan Greenspan back in the early 2000s with the dot-com bubble, when we got to that peak, and normally we would have had, in this diagram, this one would be the small fire, where we come back down to the small ship. We tried to avoid it by, one of the mechanisms they use was low interest rates. They want to keep people, encourage people to invest, but it was kind of ignoring the information, it was kind of ignoring the feedback that there was, that it's not growing because it's not supposed to grow anymore, because there's other factors that it shouldn't go like that. But when we prop this up, this is the same thing, I guess, as allowing tinder or other things that should be eliminated. When we allow them to build up, then it can cause a bigger crash in the end. And so one of the points I want to stress is that we can't really hide or escape from this uncertainty and risk, and we have to embrace them. We need to do the best in light of them and try to make ourselves prepared for them and take advantage of them to get stronger. And going back to the economics example and looking at our individual versus collective, we could say entrepreneurs and people with different ideas, there's a bunch of these, and these things are fragile, these can come and go. But because of this process of selection, we can find out what's really good and worthwhile, and those are the ones that will help our economy and innovation to stay strong. And then another quote by Thomas Edison I thought was really cool. I'm sure you've all heard this before, is that we're not perfect. We're never going to be able to do everything right the exact first time. What we need to do is, we're going to make mistakes, and we have to learn from them and try to minimize the downfall from them, and just keep pushing along. And this, again, here's the same thing with science. We have hypotheses and experiments that aren't always right. Even individual scientists, none of their ideas has ever been right. But by weeding out these experiments and hypotheses and ideas, science and technology can advance as a whole and get much stronger. So I guess in conclusion, steps to becoming anti-fragile. First, we shouldn't shy away from difficulty, and this doesn't mean we needlessly confront it. But if we have reason to believe that it could lead to something worse in the future, we need to not kind of like with the economy right now, we're trying to get things stimulated again. Some people say that it's just going to be worse when we do finally confront the facts of our spending habits and stuff like that. Second, while we shouldn't shy away from difficulty, that doesn't mean we just keep doing the same things over and over again. We got to learn from the mistakes that we do and try to fix things in the future. The third thing, keep an open mind. This is going back to what we were talking earlier with matter, is that you can't, oftentimes we get very focused on one thing in our life, and we go after one thing, and you're very single-minded, and when something doesn't work out, you're often kind of stuck, and you become fragile to an extent, and you can't go off. We got to keep an open mind about all types of things, and be willing to go in a different direction than we otherwise would have gone. So you always got to, your first inclination, your first path may not be the best. We've got to be open to other ones. And then when those opportunities present themselves, we have to seize those opportunities and make sure, and we all want to have constant progress and all the time and always moving forward. But by doing these and realizing the reality of the situation and not just seeing things as they really are instead of as we want them to be, I think we can achieve slow yet steady progress for the future.